Okay, continuing with our vulnerability lecture, the last in the list was our environmental vulnerability. So, environmental vulnerability is a kind of vulnerability that actually is because of the inherent properties of the environment itself. So, for example, some of the environments are uh, more vulnerable to the same level of hazard whenever they are exposed equally. So just a good example is if you think of the reefs. So coral reefs are the kind of how to say ecology or the congregation of the corals which are very sensitive to a certain degree of level of rise of water salinity or temperature. So in a way, coral reefs are very beautiful. Normally, they are found in the bottom of the ocean bed, or bottom of the ocean, or in the ocean bed. And there are many areas which are places of tourist attraction because people like to go to visit these coral reefs and then just be mesmerized by this beauty. But at the same time, these coral reefs are very sensitive to even a smaller degree of rise of temperature or uh, some of the parameters of the water, especially the salinity. So salinity means how much of salt is there or the level of pH or the acidic or basic the water is. So if there are students from chemistry here, they will understand what is a pH. pH of the water, if I say that the pH of the water, I am ultimately pointing to how acidic or basic the water is. Okay, so if the pH level is more than 7, it is towards the what, acidic or basic, towards the basic. Or if it is towards less than 7, then it indicates that there are these waters are acidic. Okay, so just cross check this thing one more time. What is a pH? So in chemical terms, it is minus concentration of or negative concentration of OH ion. Anyway, for other people, just remember that pH is a parameter which indicates how much the water is acidic or basic. অসমীয়াত when we say how টেঙা বা খাৰুৱা এই দুটা বস্তু. So the normally the coral reefs or the coral environment is very sensitive to this pH level. Now look at the problem. What is happening when there is a gradual rise of global temperature because of the greenhouse effect. Now we are always talking about this greenhouse effect because we cannot really escape these terms. Whenever we talk about disaster, we have to bring into the climate change. Okay? Uh, because of there is gradual rise of temperature due to the greenhouse effect, and then this excess temperature is being absorbed by the ocean waters, and by doing so, the ocean or the sorry this not the temperature, the carbon dioxide is being absorbed by the water, and in the process the water is actually turning to be more of acidic. That means সাগৰৰ পানী বেছি টেঙা টেঙা হৈ গৈ আছে gradually. So in the process, the coral reefs, they are starting to die away. And then many of the coral reefs, which were earlier very beautiful communities, have now completely vanished out of the picture of the earth. So one example is the Great Barrier Reef, that is in Australian waters. So another example is the glacier. The glaciers are very sensitive to the rise of temperature. So I can give you plenty of examples where glaciers are melting. Whenever you talk about the Himalayan glaciers or the glaciers in the Alps or glaciers in the Andes mountains, all these glaciers are actually starting to melt. Why? Because these environments are inherently more vulnerable than the other environments. For example, if a sudden change of a temperature, if the temperature is rising all over the globe, imagine it is rising at an average rate, even then the glaciers or the coral reefs will be more affected than suppose the tropical climates or the subtropical climates. So these environments, some of the environments are, they do have an inherent vulnerability because the way they are. So a few of the examples maybe the glaciers, the coral reefs, the coastal areas are sensitive to increasing threat from sea level rise. So if the sea level is rising, then people who are actually living in the coastal areas or the coastal areas itself, they are actually at a greater level of vulnerability than who are living inside the mainland or towards the higher altitudes. Okay. So what kind of vulnerabilities now we have discussed? One is the physical vulnerability. Uh, for example, physical vulnerability, the different types of houses, the different construction materials, or the different ways of construction that can contribute to the physical vulnerability during the time of the hazard, particularly in floods. Then we talk about the social vulnerability. Social vulnerability would include your beliefs and customs, your culture, or not only that, how peaceful the country is, how good the governance is, okay, how far the judiciary is functioning, is the country at war, or all these factors ultimately, or how much is the population density, this all will contribute to this kind of vulnerability. Then thirdly was our economic vulnerability, which is a very important aspect of vulnerability. How much money you have to spend during the time or after the time of a disaster in order to mitigate it or in order to nullify the bad effects of the disaster. Okay, ultimately you can reduce your vulnerability. How much money is there to spend? Then the last one is the environment or environmental vulnerability. Where the environment is, or what are the inherent properties of the environment itself that will determine the vulnerability of this environment. And now remember, again, just take back uh, what are the takeaways from these lectures are that we talked about the hazard, we talked about disaster. We knew the difference between a hazard and a disaster. Then we came into the crucial point of vulnerability. But whenever I talk about the hazard, just remember hazard immediately has a probability of occurrence. It's a natural thing. It can be measured in terms of its attributes, in terms of the magnitudes of the hazards. And then there is a common terminology to compare one hazard from a different hazard is by the way of the return period, or you can compare it several different hazards happening in different years. You can compare the severity of the hazard or the magnitude of the hazard in terms of the return period. The return period, higher the return period, the lesser is the probability of occurrence, or more is the magnitude, and vice versa. And then we came to vulnerability. Vulnerability, according to the definition, is whenever I say a vulnerability, it is the degree of loss or degree or the amount of loss. Okay, so uh, these are very crucial terms whenever you want to study disaster or disaster related issues, disaster management. So hazard, vulnerability, capacity, exposure, risk. There are plenty of other terms, but especially these terms hazard, vulnerability, disaster, and risk. And next in the list of our important terminologies will be the exposure. So exposure is actually, as the definition here we go, it says the degree to which the elements at risk are exposed to a particular hazard. So exposure is the degree to which elements are at element at risk are exposed. So how far you are exposed. For example, just imagine the situation when you have two houses. One is your house, you have a friend's house, your house is inundated up to half a feet, and your friend's house is inundated up to 6 feet. So in that case, your friend's house has a greater level of exposure, okay, to the hazard. For another example, maybe if we were living uh, near the epicenter of a particular earthquake, and somebody is living, suppose 100 kilometer away from the earthquake, so that person who is actually living near to the epicenter of the earthquake will have a greater degree of exposure. Okay. Again, for tsunamis, people who are living around the coastal belts, they will have a bigger degree of exposure than someone who is actually far away from these coastal areas. So, exposure also is an important terminology, and it is the degree up to which you are exposed to a particular hazard. So, exposure may be um, up with the different attributes of the floods or different attributes of an earthquake. It can be the depth, it can be duration again. So suppose you have two patches of cultivating areas, and one of the fields of paddy, it is exposed, it is inundated for 1 month. Another type of paddy actually was inundated for 1 week. So the first example, I would say it would have a greater degree of exposure. Okay. So another example, if you are from somebody who is familiar with the flooding situation in Dhemaji or Lakhimpur, maybe you know that the Jiadal River dumps a lot of sands in the cultivating fields. So sometimes if you go to the field, then you will see that those areas like Kopatoli and then those areas in the downstream of the river, okay, you will see that the river has actually dumped sands, particularly sands, in various areas according to different heights. So the height of the sand will actually also an indication of the level of exposure of that particular family or that community. In some areas, if sand dumping is happening maybe 10 feet, in some areas sand is being dumped 2 feet. So definitely 10 feet sand dumping will have a higher level of exposure. Or especially the exposure is for the people or the communities or to the elements at risk. Okay, so elements at risk will include all the people, all the families, all the livestock, all your paddy fields, your roads and buildings and houses, all these things, whichever or whatever actually might have, uh, they have a chance that they will cross the sphere of the hazard in the greater context. These all will be the elements at risk. So, degree to which these elements at risk are exposed is the exposure. So, by the UNISD's definition, people, property systems, or other elements present in hazard zones that are thereby subject to potential losses. Okay, so this is according to the UNISD's definition. So ultimately, we have come into the final or the most important definition whenever we would like to discuss this issue of disaster. So what is risk then? Okay, so risk in terms of disaster management or in terms of any disaster related subjects is given by the equation that you see it in bold fonts here on the screen. Risk is nothing but hazard multiplied by vulnerability. Okay? Okay, so far you know what is hazard? Hazard is the probability of occurrence. Whenever I talk about a hazard, immediately you should say that this is a natural event, origin at nature, it has a probability of occurrence. Higher the probability, lesser is the chance of occurrence. Okay, no. Higher is the probability. More likely that the event will be of less magnitude. Less is the probability, vice versa. Then you multiply hazard with vulnerability. So vulnerability is nothing but your degree of loss. So ultimately, if you combine these two things, then you will achieve a word known as a risk. So by definition, Risk is probability of loss. So hazard is probability of occurrence, vulnerability is degree of loss. So you multiply these two terms, then you'll get to risk, which is nothing but probability of loss. Okay, so look at the definition. It says it considers the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses. That's what I say. Risk is probability of expected loss. Expected loss. So this may come in different forms. It can be in deaths, it can be in injuries, property damage, or loss of livelihoods, economic disruption, okay, environmental damage, whatever you want to say. So during this time of the pandemic, many people have lost their livelihoods. Okay, nobody would have imagined that there will be no jobs during this point of time. So the moment the pandemic struck, there was a risk that my job will not more that I don't have a livelihood. I will be deprived of my livelihood if this is going to continue for another 3 months, for another 4 months. So in that case, it may be worth saying that there was a risk. Risk of what? Of a loss of livelihood. Because the moment I say risk, it says that there was a probability of loss or probability of damage or the probability of harmful consequence. So in my case, suppose I don't have a job right now, it would be a harmful consequence. Uh, Again, if there is an earthquake and then some people are getting killed, maybe that also had that will ultimately be conveyed in terms of risk. So if the earthquake comes during the daytime, the risk may be little bit less compared if the earthquake comes during the night. Why? Because if the earthquake comes during the night, many people will be sleeping inside their houses unaware that the earthquake has struck, and then they will have a lesser time to react. So the risk that somebody may lose their lives in the incident of an earthquake is more if the earthquake comes during the night. So this is the probability of loss or probability of damage. That will be determined by the level of vulnerability. In that, just imagine two situations. So just to get a good idea or picture of this definition, just you can just compare it. Okay, imagine a situation when there is an earthquake that comes during the day, magnitude 5, same epicenter, same depth, same natural settings. Similar earthquake comes during the night. So in the first case, people have a chance to run away, not because run away because it is during the daytime. So if you look at the formula or the equation, you will say that risk is hazard multiplied by vulnerability. In that case, hazard part is the same. Hazard is the probability of occurrence. So probability of occurrence of a 4 magnitude earthquake or 5 magnitude earthquake during the day and during the night, it is the same. But the ultimate variable or the factor that will influence the risk is the vulnerability part. So during the daytime, the vulnerability is a little bit less because people are awake. People have a time to react. Okay? But during the night, people are sleeping. They even don't know if there is an earthquake or not. So this time or the moment when the earthquake comes actually will influence the vulnerability even if the magnitude of both the earthquakes are same, just because the time when they are happening. So that will ultimately decide people are at lesser risk or people are at a higher risk. Okay, so sometimes there may be a change of the hazard term or there may be a change of the vulnerability. So that will ultimately depend or ultimately decide how far the risk will be from a particular hazard. Okay, do you have any questions? Yes. I would expect some questions from you. Okay, by the way, I just checked the attendances today. I could see only people from social science are present today. What happened to the sciences people? Last week, I asked them to just really reschedule their CBCS because I think at that point, that right now they are having some other classes. If it not really been changed, uh, then they would have problem in continuing with this class. CBCS for whole of the university is decided yesterday during the time from 9 to 10 and then today from 9 to 11. So other than that, you cannot have the CBCS class because we have to all uh, agree to this time slot. Otherwise, difficult for other people to come and then join the class. So I think they have not really talked to their HOD regarding the timing. Are there people who are from a different faculty except faculty of social sciences here? I don't see anyone. I tell again, if you happen to meet your friends, tell me that in my class, really attendance is quite an issue. I take it quite importantly. At the end of the class or at the end of the semester, if you really cannot show up for 75%, okay, okay. So some are there from science, but particularly the zoology people, they had this problem last time, as I remember. You have to really talk. Hmm. Okay, anyway, just keep this thing in mind, okay? Because I could see 16 people today present, and the total number who are supposedly registering for this course is 37. So not even 50% are here. At the end, I will not really consider. And if though this is a CBCS course, which is supposed to be general introduction to all the subjects, but even then, this subject has a flow. So if you miss a part of this lecture, though I'll give you the videos and then other things, I don't know how far you'll be able to cope it. It's okay. Otherwise, you will increase your level of vulnerability. Okay. So risk is nothing but hazard multiplied by vulnerability, and then risk can actually be quantified. Quantified means you can you can see or visualize or quantify this thing in terms of numbers. So if I say that my risk of going today to a particular hospital setting without wearing a mask, what is the risk? So you should be able to give me a number. So I'll say, oh, your risk. If I say if it is zero, there is no risk. And if I say one, you have an absolute risk. So it will vary from zero up to one. So zero being no risk and one being you are completely or you have a certainty of 100% that you are at risk. So if I go to a hospital today, I go to visit a patient today without wearing a mask, I have a risk. So that can be quantified. At the same time, you can think of a disaster situation. So if I built my house, okay, now there is a lean period. That means there is a reduction of the base flow in the river, and the river is gradually drying up. And then you see that okay, there are land that has been cleared, and I want to build my house there in the river. Then I have a risk. There may be no river water now, but by the time the season change, there is again rainfall, the river will be having floods. So I will expose myself at that point of time to a greater level of risk. Or even now, I am at risk if I build my house at a certain location in the floodplain if I think that there is no water that is going to come during that point of time. Okay, similar examples maybe. Uh, what else? Okay, if I build my house, if I cut the slope now in the hilly areas, now I put myself at a risk. That is why. So what I expect from you is that after completing this lecture, you at least use these terminologies correctly. So I expect you to be a little bit different from laymen in the terms that you are actually familiar with the definition of these terms. So sometimes if someone says that, okay, oh, look at this disaster happening in the middle of the ocean. So you should really correct it that if the hazard doesn't really cross the human lives, it is not a disaster. So use these words correctly. So in order to use the words correctly, you have to again and again and again introspect whatever you have learned till now, and then look for yourself, read books, and then journals, and then find the correct word that actually fits these sentences. Or someone may be saying, but at least from your part, you should be a little bit clear about these terminologies: risk, hazard, vulnerability, then um, what was it? Exposure, disaster, hazard, those kind of things. So another thing that if you go farther and farther, you will see that there is a word called capacity. So if I look at the syllabus here, we are still discussing these things: hazard, risk, vulnerability, disaster. Okay, then we go to disaster management. So the meaning, what is a disaster management? So why disaster management is important? What is the main goal of disaster management? Then dimensions and scope of disaster management. That means if you really study disaster management, where can actually you fit right now? And what are the four steps of disaster management cycle? So disaster management is actually a cycle, and really later on you will understand. Then India, we have a disaster management framework. So we'll discuss a little bit on that. Then how the money is being arranged if you have a disaster, how the state governments act in accordance with the framework that has already been established, where the money flows, who correspond or who finances in order for rehabilitation or relief, this kind of operations. And then if some there is an international NGO, uh, how this money is actually being transferred into a country scenario. And national strategy for disaster reduction. So reduction means disaster management and disaster reduction are two different terms. Disaster reduction means if you want to really mitigate the disaster, what are the steps that as you can take, and then how what are the strategies, what is the Hugo framework. Okay, these kind of things we'll discuss here. Then module 2, actually I think we have little bit already touched these things: natural disasters, their meanings in nature. Natural disasters already we have discussed. Types and effects. So the type of disaster we have already discussed: hydrological disaster, floods, flash flood, droughts, and cloudbursts. These things we have discussed already. Geological disaster, earthquakes, landslides. So these things also we have discussed. Wind related or also heat and cold waves. So basically we have covered module 2 before module 1. So inside module 1 actually we have really covered many of the things in module 2. But even then, if you may have a doubt in these or any of these terms, you can just really ask myself, okay, what is a natural disaster? So what is an avalanche? What is a volcanic eruption? These are like rudimentary questions. Okay, then later on in module 3, we will start whatever uh, the remote sensing part. So for this, the things will be really interesting up till starting from here. So basic concepts in remote sensing. So I will basically take another 2 lectures maybe in order to cover this module 1. Okay. So it is 11 o'clock. I will not take much of your time because another class may start. So for the time being, I'll just stop here. Okay. You have any doubts? You can text me or just ask me in the chat group. Uh, yes. Keep yourself updated. Okay. Bye bye. Do you have any questions till now?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay, I'll tell you one more thing. In between, I want to go for a sudden test. That would be multiple choice questions, mostly covering these two modules, module 1 and module 2. So, any moment of time, I will take this class test. I will not tell you before when I am going to take it. It will be of 30 marks, and this will contribute to your first or overall sessional. Okay. So in the CBCS, you have sessional. You see, in SAM is 40. So this first sudden class test will contribute how much you can get out of 40 as a part of your sessional. Okay. I will not mention when I'm going to tell, but it will be sudden. It will be in the Google Classroom.